Welcome, everyone, to the newest edition of the DOA Podcast with Jeff Ward. Thank you so much for joining me on this fine day. Might I humbly encourage you to pour yourself whatever you enjoy drinking, to find a nice, easy chair to relax in, gird your loins, and get out your scorecards, because we are going to talk about the Shadwick King retrial closing arguments in a bit more depth than I did in my July 18th column on thefirstwar.net. And that column was pretty thorough, too. And though Greg Sams and Kathleen Zellner's closings were at least 3 times longer than they had to be, I mean, if you thought I can't be brief, go talk to your average attorney. But when you essentially listen to all of it, distill it down, realize that you're seeing a rare circumstantial evidence-based murder trial before a judge and not a jury, it does become abundantly more fascinating. But before we get started in earnest, if you haven't quite caught up with the trial, the ongoing details of the trial, I would heartily encourage you to avail yourself of thefirstwar.net, where you can find previous podcasts on this topic, as well as a couple columns. To set the stage, Courtroom 319, that's Judge John Barsani's courtroom, in the Kane County Judicial Center, was generally at full capacity until later in the afternoon. And the way closings go in criminal trials is the state gets the first shot. They get to start off the festivities. Then the defense gets their shot. And because the state has a much higher burden of proof, they have to prove that the defendant is guilty beyond any and all reasonable doubt, while all the defense has to do is instill reasonable doubt. The state gets a rebuttal closing argument. And in this case, I can't be exactly sure. I did have to go home and take care of a few things, but Greg Sams' rebuttal closing was actually longer than his closing. They were about 5 hours long in total. And let me tell you that sitting in the gallery of that courtroom, the audience, for lack of a better term, those church pews are rather rough on a skinny white boy's butt. But I somehow managed to survive, with just minor injuries. The things I do for journalism, right? All right, so as we've already stipulated in previous broadcasts, Greg Sams was the lead prosecutor on the case. I couldn't recognize the second and third chairs because of the whole mask thing. Some folks still are wearing masks in the courtroom. Judge John Barsani was wearing one of the biggest ones I'd ever seen on one of the trial days. And Kathleen Zellner, the well-regarded DuPage County defense attorney who specializes in overturning wrongful convictions, had quite the team with her. I would say it was 5 or 6 people on that day, though she did all the closing statements. And when I got into the courtroom at about 9:20 that Monday morning, Greg Sams had already started, but I got there early enough that finally, the prosecution opened their summation with their flippin' best evidence. And we've talked about this already. The body position. Again, the only way Catherine King, I'm going to refer to her as Kate because of Kathleen Zellner. The only way Kate could have fallen in that position is if she was running down the railroad tracks like the Tasmanian devil in Bugs Bunny. One look at that picture and you know somebody placed her there, particularly when you note that her neck is perfectly draped over the inside rail. And when I say rail, I mean the Union Pacific tracks running through Geneva near Route 25. Sams continued with the fact that her clothing made absolutely no sense. One of her ankle-height running socks was put on upside down. Her shirt was pulled up over her bra. Her shorts were untied and she wasn't wearing any underwear. Her bra was pulled up over her right nipple. I mean, I can kind of understand now why Ms. Zellner went with a bench trial, because no woman on the jury could look at that manner of dress and that body position and not immediately conclude that her husband murdered her. Worse yet, Kate owned 9 running bras, but the bra she was wearing that day was a frilly magenta underwire bra that was put on twisted. Zellner tried to claim that that was a result of the fact that she still had a blood alcohol content of 0.15 the next morning, but I'm sorry. Putting on a bra or a guy putting on his underwear, it's all reflexive. And if it doesn't feel right, no matter how intoxicated you might be, you're going to fix it unconsciously. You're not even going to think about doing it. And no woman in her right mind, even drunk, would possibly go running in an underwire bra. I mean, that could do some real damage if you did any more than 3 miles. Sams also briefly touched on the fact that who in their right mind, drunk or sober, would go running or even walking on railroad track ballast. I mean, those rocks are sharp, they're unstable, and you can't run on the tracks themselves. You'd have to have the perfect cadence to land on the railroad ties. Not to mention the problems that could occur with the train coming. And if you had 13 drinks the evening before, the last thing you want to do is get near that Union Pacific Metro line with trains every 10 minutes, blasting their horns at every intersection. And they'd certainly be blasting their horns at a perceived runner or pedestrian moving along the tracks. Then Sams moved on to his second line of attack, which was Kate's injuries were not consistent with her collapsing from sudden cardiac arrhythmia. The dirt patterns weren't correct. Her knees weren't scraped. He explained that when you fall from full height, I don't know how tall Kate was. She was a petite woman. When you fall from full height, you put your hands out, to protect the rest of you from the fall. She had no injuries on her hands. Her chin was touching the rail, according to Sams. Zellner disputed that, and she had no damage to her teeth. Again, had she fallen from, 5 feet, 5 inches, or however tall she was, and her mouth had hit the rail, there would certainly be some damage. And this wasn't as powerful a part of his closing, but Sams went on to explain that her injuries were consistent with the strangulation, that the light imprints seemed to show fingers and thumb marks, or should I say finger and thumb marks. He talked about small hemorrhages in each eye. He talked about I hope I can read my handwriting here, a focal hemorrhage. Oh, never mind. I'm never going to get it. I apologize for that. And venous congestion. So you had to be somewhat of a medical expert, and veteran judges tend to be just that, in order to kind of grasp that portion of his summation. But then Sams returned to the prosecution's strength. And again, I didn't catch this the first go around, and I'm not sure if any of the newspapers reported it. But if Kate had ostensibly gone running or even walking, there's 3 things you could count on. The first is she would carry her prized cell phone in an armband case. Though she had her cell phone, it was found near her right hand. The armband was back at the house. She wasn't wearing earbuds. And Kate always went running or walking with earbuds, listening to music played from her phone. But to me, the most damning portion of that lack of physical evidence was the fact that no contacts or glasses were found at the scene. And the prosecution did a pretty good job of, showing Kate's contacts at the house and arguing that it was the first thing she did. She put on her contacts every morning. It's starting to paint a picture that someone was incredibly rushed when they, quote, put her together to deposit her body on the railroad tracks. And I actually found both closings a little disjointed. I thought they could both flow a little bit better, because I would have saved the staged crime scene bit till the end to tie it all together. But Sams got into it early on in his closing, where he basically said clearly, based on all the evidence the state has just provided, it's clear that she died somewhere else. Her body was positioned on the tracks. She didn't fall. And that if it wasn't staged, there'd be no need to move the body. Or should I say, if he didn't kill her, there would be no need to move the body. Then Sams got into the weaker part of his argument, which was the electronic digital evidence. He played a lot of Shadwick King allowed himself to be interviewed by the Geneva police for 2 straight days. And Sams played a lot of that video, which was kind of fascinating. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And what Sams tried to do with his initial foray into browser history, et cetera, was to impeach Shadwick King's statement to the Geneva police that he didn't keep tabs on his wife. And he took an awful long time to do it. And, so he checked on her, where she was spending money when she was gone for long periods of time. He clearly knew the name of her paramour. If you recall, they texted each other some insane amount, like 3,000 times in 2 weeks. And he tried to find him online. He had trouble spelling the last name, but he clearly knew who it was. But I'm not so sure that worked. It certainly wouldn't have worked. It certainly would not have worked with the jury because, any guy who suspects his wife is having an affair for real or even an emotional affair is going to do those kinds of simple things. It's not like he hired a PI or he started following her. He was kind of interested in what might be going on. It does seem like Shadwick was a bit of a laid back guy, but by the end of the trial, I was going, boy, I think there's such a thing as too laid back. And Kathleen Zellner used that in her closing defense, that Shadwick was so laid back he never would have killed her. And that actually was one of her better arguments. But where Sams did succeed in that digital realm is pointing out all the inconsistencies between what Shadwick King said to the police, what he told the police, and what his internet history would indicate. For example, he told the Geneva Police Department that he had no clue what this texter guy's name was, and clearly he had attempted to search it 2 weeks before. Sams noted that the morning Kate was found on the tracks, that Shadwick had withdrawn $500 from a local ATM at 5 a.m. To anybody with 2 connected brain cells, that sounds an awful lot like a flight mentality, like he was going to take off somewhere. He tried to take out more money, but he hit the limit. He deleted his web history after Kate ostensibly died, which implies a guilty conscience. Which at least implies a guilty conscience. Shadwick also tried to say, and Kathleen Zellner picked up on this, that he wasn't smart enough to pull this whole staged death scene off. But we'll get to that too, because while he may not have been a very smart man, he almost succeeded in what he was trying to do with the whole railroad track scenario. So what particularly struck me about Sam's closing was better than I expected it to be. It's not that Greg Sams is a bad lawyer, but, he's nothing to write home about either. And again, it wasn't as bad as the last time I was in that courtroom, but his constant clearing his throat and coughing. If I was on a jury, and he was giving his closing statement and he just kept doing it, I would stand up and tell the judge to force him to take a goddamn cough drop. But at least, thankfully for him, you're not going to get that same kind of visceral reaction to constant clearing your throat and coughing from a veteran judge. The second thing I took away from his argument was never talk to the police, particularly if you've committed a murder. And I would not advise you to do so, but never talk to the police. I mean, we'll get to this. Kathleen Zellner tried to paint a picture of an innocent man who was simply cooperating with the Geneva police, and that cooperation was a sign of his innocence. And I did that purposely because you can understand the silly circular logic a little better that way. But Shadwick King did not help himself in the least by talking to the police for 2 straight days. And lastly, Sams did a good enough job that by the end of his initial summation, I was convinced of Shadwick's guilt. And I know what you're thinking, but Jeff, you've already made it clear that you were convinced of his guilt. Yes, but I went into that trial, into those summations, with a clear and empty mind. I wanted to put myself in the judge's position where I hadn't come close to making a decision, and now it was time for these 2 attorneys to get into argument, to get into, convincing me, the judge, that he was guilty or innocent. So I really wondered, now that I'm convinced that blank-minded Jeff Ward is convinced of Mr. King's guilt, how is Kathleen Zellner going to unconvince me? And to spoiler, she did a good job, but she didn't quite make it over that incredibly high hurdle. Moving on to Kathleen Zellner's closing argument, I'll preface it by saying, perhaps this is a bench trial and she didn't feel like she needed to pull out all the stops, but there was very little of her legendary self-righteous indignation closing statements that she's so famous for. There was some of it, and she started off with a little bit where she correctly noted that the far higher burden of proof is on the state. She could have said nothing. She could have had nobody testify, and the state still has to prove that Shadwick King contributed to his wife's death. We'll get to that in order to get a guilty verdict. All she has to do is instill the smallest amount of reasonable doubt. So that was a great start. Remind the judge that, hey, my standard isn't nearly high as theirs. She went into contradictory experts. And when I say contradictory experts, I mean contradictory experts for the prosecution. She pointed out a lot of inconsistencies between their testimony, but I don't know. I wouldn't have started there. It's not terribly powerful testimony. It's not like they were truly consistent. I'm sorry, it's not like they were truly inconsistent. It's just that it seemed like they were those experts, those state experts, saw it through the lens of their own professional glasses. Kate consistently said, Kathleen consistently said that the state hasn't proven there was a homicide and they haven't proven a time of death. But again, we're going to, by the time we get to Sam's rebuttal argument, we'll dispense with that contention in short order. Zellner said the investigation was misguided, that yes, it was a suspicious death, but they rushed to judgment. They rushed to charge and convict Shadwick King. And then, again, this was a fascinating segue, I guess, for lack of a better term, a fascinating contention. But Kate seemed to want to prove that fact, want to prove that the police and the emergency medical technicians didn't do their jobs by claiming Kate was still alive when they found her. But while Kate was the first one to condemn the state's experts, she then relied upon the freight train engineer, the eastbound freight train engineer, who saw Kate's body, stopped the train, and called it into 911. She said that gentleman claimed he, quote, saw a little breath. But Greg Sams countered that in his rebuttal by saying it was a windy day. Perhaps her shirt fluttered a little bit. And even if that wasn't the case, am I a juror or am I the judge going to put the fate of this case in the hands of a medical expert, perhaps, or an engineer who is not a medical expert? I think the answer to that question is a good one. But that was Kathleen Zellner's theme throughout the whole closing. She was still alive when they found her. And now that's something that could play with the jury. That would be a fascinating defensive tactic if she had put the Geneva police and the emergency responders on trial. But she didn't. I understand that she understands that she's got to instill reasonable doubt in the judge. But boy, I think that in this case particularly is a much higher standard. And as part of her rush to judgment argument, Kate said that Shadwick's grief when he was first interviewed by the Geneva police and his complete cooperation, I quote, were indications of innocence. But quite frankly, I think Shadwick killed Kate in a drunken stupor. I think they were both drunk. He'd been cheated on once before. I think the laid-back guy finally flipped out. And I think the grief was he regretted killing his wife. And the cooperation, I think that, like I said, was a really bad idea. It certainly didn't help his cause. Zellner pointed out that Shadwick readily offered information. Yeah, but Sams did a pretty good job pointing out that critical pieces of that data were false. Zellner said that further evidence of Shadwick's willingness to roll with the punches, so to speak, was that he knew about these texts and he didn't do anything to Kate. But I'm not sure he knew about 3,000 texts. I think he found out about some of them, and he did text Kate, I think when she was at a Cubs game or something, "What the hell, Kate?" And I mean, I suppose there's something to, him not murdering her right away, but there's no doubt in my mind that he was the cause of her death. Zellner added that there was no cleaning of the house, which you would expect of someone who just killed their wife. But, if you think about that one, why would you expect it? This was Kate King's house, too. What are you going to clean up? It would be more suspicious if they didn't find her DNA than if they did. And one of Kate's major contentions near the end of her closing was that the police and forensic experts didn't find a single Kathleen King hair on Shadwick's body immediately after the murder. But to me, like I just said, that's even more suspect. Apparently, according to Zellner, Kate shed quite a bit. And the fact that there was absolutely none of her hair on somebody she slept next to in the same bed. I don't know about you, but my wife's hair is all over our shared bathroom to the point where I joke it's going to have to pay its share of the rent for being on my side of the double sinks. And as it turns out, the lack of house cleaning after Kate's death kind of sank Shadwick in Greg Sam's rebuttal argument. We'll get to that. I keep saying we'll get to that. I promise you we will get to all of it. I have taken copious notes. Kathleen Zellner correctly argued there was no medical finding specific to strangulation. There was no defense marks. In other words, you would think that her theory is you would think that if Shadwick attacked her and the prosecution claimed that an arm bruise was proof of that he grabbed her, that there would have been defensive wounds. But, you know what? If she had a blood alcohol content of 0.15 the next day, it's probably over 0.2 the previous day. And how effectively can you fight back when you're that drunk? And like I said, Kate was not, a big woman. In fact, Zellner at one point said that Shadwick, with his tricky knee, apparently some expert testified to that, couldn't carry a 150-pound woman, through railroad ballast onto the tracks. Well, there's no way Kate King weighed 150 pounds. Looking at her laying on the tracks in her running clothes, she was a very petite woman. I would say 120 pounds at best. And that would be a little easier to carry a 120-pound woman wrapped in a sheet than it would be to carry a 150-pound woman. Then Zellner went back to the defense's persistent core argument that Kate died of sudden cardiac arrhythmia because of an electrolyte imbalance from being drunk and trying to go running. But where the defense clearly failed in that regard is that they gave absolutely no reason, they provided no reason that a healthy, active, 32-year-old woman who could drink a lot, mind you, she could outdrink me, and that's really saying something, would collapse while walking on the railroad tracks. One of the things Sams effectively did in his not quite as effective rebuttal is note the times that Kate had kind of binge drank, if that's how you say it, 4 or 5 times before, the early July date of her death. I want to say July 6th, back in 2014. And, the defense really didn't have an answer for that. Why didn't she die when she drank a lot at the bars across from Wrigley Field? Why didn't she die at the July 5th party where she drank quite a bit? And that really took the wind out of Zellner's sails. I mean, her persistent lack of an explanation for why this woman would die of something like that was completely lacking. And her expert, Dr. Bloom, who I believe I've talked about in the podcast and perhaps written about, I mean, he's got an incredible curriculum vitae, but he just kind of said, yeah, she died of sudden cardiac arrhythmia, with absolutely no seeming basis for saying, well, okay, that she had this issue, and there was an undetected this issue. Nothing. It's just like he bought into the defense and pretty much said what they wanted him to say. I'm not saying he was lying, but his testimony didn't carry nearly as much weight with me because he just said it happened out of the blue. I suppose those things can happen. And maybe that in and of itself could provide reasonable doubt, but the weight of the rest of the circumstantial evidence, kind of descended on Shadwick King like an avalanche. And then Zellner came up with 2 theories that are entirely unbelievable. And I think it really sank her case. There are times when there are just doors you don't want to open. Even though a closing argument doesn't open you to further testimony, it's the kind of thing that you really don't want to make the judge perk up too much at this point. And the first one was how Zellner claimed Kate fell. You've got the prosecution saying she likely would have collapsed from a standing position. Zellner contended Kate felt the sudden cardiac arrhythmia coming on, fell to her knees first, lightly, then bent over on her hands, dropping her cell phone, which was in her right hand and not in the armband case, before collapsing onto the tracks. A, it's not believable to begin with. And B, once again, getting back to my core argument, of course I only play an attorney on TV, is that there's no way she could have ended up in her final position if that were the case. She would have been likely lying by the side of the tracks, parallel to them. But here's the worst part of that section of Zellner's closing argument. She claimed that Kate had felt the SCA, sudden cardiac arrhythmia effects, even before she started going down. And she started to panic and tried to flag down a train by waving both arms above her head, which would account for the bra being pulled up the way it was. Well, I don't think it would necessarily account for it. And it still doesn't account for Kate wearing a twisted underwire bra to go running when she had 9 separate running bras. And why would she want to flag down a non-existent train? Because there's no evidence any other Metra or Union Pacific employee saw her instead of just dialing 911 on the phone in her right hand. These are the kinds of arguments attorneys apply when they're trying to create reasonable doubt in one juror, not trying to create it in the mind of a veteran felony court judge. Zellner further argued, and we've discussed this a little bit before, that Kate had iron oxide on her running shoes. She chided the prosecution for not testing those shoes, but iron oxide is rust. And what does that prove? Zellner tried to say she accumulated it from the railroad ballast, those large jagged stones. But you can get rust on your running shoes from any number of places. And even Zellner admitted that, her experts couldn't prove the timing. When did the iron oxide get on her shoes? So that fell completely flat. Zellner also said the wear on Kate's running shoes was consistent with somebody walking on an uneven surface. But for how long? Again, there are folks that will argue with me to my dying day, but no drunk person goes running or even walking on railroad track ballast. It's too uneven. You're bound to fall. And this is the singular Zellner argument that really surprised me. She essentially echoed King's own statement by saying he's not smart enough to pull this off. Well, if you look at the totality of this, staging a death on the railroad tracks, as a scenario I've taken completely apart in this podcast, wasn't the most brilliant idea. Zellner tried to say that any reasonable person would, drop the body on a running path somewhere or in a forest near a running path. But I think, and of course anybody within the sound of my voice likely thinks, that King was trying to destroy the evidence by draping her neck across the track. Had an eastbound train come first, that engineer would not have had the benefit of the wide-angle view of the adjoining track that the eastbound freight train engineer did. So the westbound engineer likely would not have seen her from that far narrower straight-on perspective. And having, he likely would have seen her at the last minute, but at that point, it would have been impossible to stop the train. And let me tell you, when you get hit by something as weighty as a freight train, and the westbound trains heading through Geneva tend to be going a lot faster than their eastbound counterparts, it can vaporize a body. If you recall, I think 10 years back, a bicyclist was killed, a road biker, in the western reaches of Kane County at an unmarked track. And let me tell you, there was nothing left of the body. We walked the tracks. I didn't walk it for very long. And you could just find vaporized body parts. And had the upper half or even the upper third of Kate's body been destroyed, now a potential suicide would be well within the realm of reasonable doubt. And the one eerie thing that I discovered by talking to a number of folks after I attended the closings is it should have been an eastbound train. There was an eastbound train heading that way, and it would have superseded the train that saw Kate's body, but it had mechanical difficulties and was forced to stop before Geneva, backing up that whole line. I don't know if I believe people reaching out from the hereafter in an effort to seek some semblance of revenge on their killer. Perhaps that's something for another podcast. But given the circumstances, it's certainly something we would have to consider. So, maybe Shadwick's death scene staging wasn't all that stupid because it almost worked. And by the way, after watching so much of his testimony in the Geneva police interviews, Shadwick strikes me as, somebody of average to low average intelligence. Come on, we can't all be geniuses. There's a reason that we have the word average. And, he's just not the smartest man. And I have no issue believing this railroad thing was the best he could come up with. And like I keep saying, it almost worked. But the best part of Zellner's argument was when she turned to Judge Barsani while pointing at Shadwick King and said, "Are we going to convict this man on the basis of a twisted bra?" I mean, and that statement, that argument gave me a little more insight into the reason, once again, that Zellner picked a bench trial. I still think it was a really bad reason. I think her summation would have done much better in front of 12 jurors who couldn't get out of jury duty. But my mental response to that is no, we are not going to convict this man on the basis of a twisted bra. We're going to convict him on the basis of every last shred of circumstantial evidence, which points to the fact that Shadwick King murdered his wife in a jealous rage. So moving on to Greg Sam's rebuttal, which was, 4 or 5 times longer than it needed to be, and it wasn't nearly as effective as his initial closing was either. He essentially asserted that Kate was not alive when the Union Pacific engineer and the emergency medical personnel found her. He argued that even having a 0.15 blood alcohol content the next day wasn't being, Kate wasn't severely drunk enough to have, sudden cardiac arrhythmia. And there's something to that because, real drinkers can blow 0.3s and over and still seem reasonably conscious. He argued that the shoe wear and the iron oxide could have pre-existed her death, or should I say the day of her death. And as we've already covered, that why was it this particular drinking episode that killed Kate? Why wasn't any of the 4 or 5 others that the prosecution had cited? Sams was also fairly effective when he pointed out that Dr. Bloom simply signed what the defense put in front of him. They signed the defense's own report. He was not the author of that report, and that did strike me as unusual. You mean he completely agreed and didn't insist upon doing it himself? I mean, he had testified in the first trial as well, but that was a little odd. He shot down the panicking and trying to flag down the train, which, that's not worthy of that. That's not worthy of Kathleen Zellner. Zellner had said that, the day of Kate's death was a rather wet and somewhat muddy day, and that there had been no mud on Shadwick's shoes. But Sams effectively countered that by saying there was no mud on Kate's shoes either, and she's the one that had to walk to and on the tracks purportedly. But then Sams really nailed it, because they took a brief break, and Sue Sarkauskas, Daily Herald reporter, and I were sitting next to each other. And we started having a conversation, and we basically said, hey, all this time of death, it just doesn't matter. The point is, if you played a part in her death, you're guilty. And almost as if he was psychic, near the end of his rebuttal argument, Sams noted the fact that the Illinois statute says that all the defendant has to do, all he has to prove, is that the defendant contributed, and those are the exact statutory words, to the death involved. And, that's a bit of a lower beyond a reasonable doubt bar. It totally destroys Zellner, she was still alive, a rush to judgment, all these arguments that might have gotten a jury to start thinking that the police and the medical personnel screwed up. Getting back to Shadwick not cleaning the house, and another excellent point Sams made. Apparently, Kate was into selfies, which turned out to be a great boon for the prosecution. And the day before she died, she took a selfie of herself standing in their bedroom doorway, and you can clearly see behind her, and there's like one towel or something on the floor, but it's generally kind of neat. Then the very next day, it's like somebody rifled through Kate's dresser, emptying everything onto the floor. And again, Sams didn't even have to say it. The first thing that popped into my mind was, he was desperate to dress her in a rush, dress her dead body, and just flung everything about in an effort to find the appropriate clothing to do it. Then Greg Sams summed up his rebuttal argument with what I think he thought was strong evidence, but while it certainly added to the mountain of circumstantial proof, it wasn't all that convincing. At one point, the Geneva Police Detective Peck asks, during the interviews, Mr. King if he was numb, upon learning the news of Kate's death. And he did, instead of saying, I've been numb since I found out, he said, I've been numb since it happened. Sams argued that was consciousness of the fact that he committed the murder. Shadwick went to his father-in-law's house shortly after the death. And his father-in-law said to him, Kate's dead. And his response was, I didn't do anything. And that is a little weird. That is a strangely defensive response when you've just lost your wife. Sams also pointed out that Shadwick never asked where Kate died. And I do find that odd. Would I convict on that omission? No. But boy, that would be the first thing I'd ask if someone murdered my wife. Where did it happen? It'd be the first thing out of my mouth. What happened? How did she die? As far as the closings in general go, and I put this in that July 18th column, Zellner kept objecting as to how the prosecution was presenting the evidence in their closing, which is kind of a bullshit maneuver because closings are the only time you get to argue in a trial. I know we all think these are great debates, but they're not. Everything else is evidence-based or impeaching evidence-based. And she had every opportunity to frame the evidence in her way, and the state has two opportunities to frame it their way. And I thought consistently interrupting Sam's closing was a little bush-legged not very effective. It certainly wouldn't have played with a jury, and I don't think it plays with a veteran felony court judge. When Sam's was done, John Barsani thanked everyone. He said barring some unforeseen delay, he wants 30 days to review the evidence. He wants to read the transcripts, and he will render his verdict on August 12th at 1:30 p.m. in courtroom 319. I plan on being there, and I also plan on being there, and I promise I will keep you informed as to what happens on that fateful day as well. So there you have it. 5 hours of closing statements encapsulated in about 45 minutes. I'm surprised we got through it that quickly, but apparently there's a benefit to taking copious notes. And I was kind of lamenting the fact that I had to take notes as opposed to using a recording device, which is a big no-no in a courtroom. But now I'm thinking, you know what? This wasn't a too terribly bad idea. It was much easier to follow the notes than it would have been to have to consistently play a recording back. Of course, as you already know, I think the verdict will be guilty. As we've previously noted, John Barsani is a runner of the marathon magnitude. And like I've been stipulating all along, there's absolutely no way a runner can look at that death scene and not believe that she was placed there. And by she, of course, I mean the late Kate King. So here's what I think happened. This then 32-year-old woman back in 2014 married a then 46-year-old man. And she did it for security. Kate seems to have led the kind of life where she was always looking for some sort of stability. But, you're married for 10 or 12 years. They had 2 kids. Shadwick isn't the most scintillating guy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with average. Nothing. And in fact, most people prefer it. But Kate, the feeling I got about Kate is that she was starting to come into her own at age 32. She was gorgeous. And I think this gentleman's attention kind of fired her up. And so I talked to a number of my longstanding female friends about that. I'm like, why didn't you just leave? If it was over, if she was done, say, you know what, it's been good, but this doesn't work for me anymore. And what those female friends told me, it doesn't work that way. She kind of wanted to have her cake and eat it too. By the way, that's no excuse to be murdered. So she didn't quite want to leave, but she really enjoyed the attention of her new boyfriend at the same time. I think had she not been murdered, she would have eventually left. I also think the new binge drinking and kind of being standoffish to her husband was the result of this kind of dichotomy of feeling, of wanting the stability of staying, but enjoying the excitement of a potential new life. And I do find it rather surprising that Shadwick murdered her, allegedly, because he is the quintessential laid-back guy. However, when you talk about the fact that he actually caught his first wife cheating on him, those things kind of stick with you. And maybe he thought if he married a much younger woman, there wouldn't be an issue with that. But the bottom line is, at one point when he kind of started to see the handwriting on the wall, he left a note for Kate saying that, if she wanted a divorce, fine. And Kate's response was, I'm not divorcing you. You're too well trained. And there is something to be said for that. But then there's the alcohol on both sides. And apparently, my God, when I had young kids, and I don't know, his kids I don't think were like pre-kindergarten, but when I had younger children, drinking was pretty much out of the picture because they kept me very, very busy. So I don't know how these two pulled that kind of thing off. But I think, again, we've talked about her post-mortem blood alcohol level. And I think he was drunk, and I think they had some sort of conversation. The fact that she was drunk, she maybe said something unfortunate. Again, not a justification for murder. Shadwick grabbed her by the arm and strangled her. And I think as soon as he was sober, he deeply regretted it. And then, of course, he panicked, staged the death scene, went to get the $500, and foolishly thought he could talk to the police for 2 days without going a long way towards incriminating himself. So in the end, though that's speculation, it's still a truly tragic story. It's a sad ending to 2 lives. that really didn't have to happen. So, with that entered into the record, it will end this somewhat longer edition of the DOA Podcast. Again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found these facts, the modalities of these closing arguments, as fascinating as I did. We all should get our butts off the couch and go to a trial every now and then. They're open to the public, and watch how our legal system truly works. I mean, TV, it's not nearly that exciting. So one more time, this has been the DOA Podcast with Jeff Ward. We just covered the totality of the Shadwick King murder retrial closing arguments. And per my previous promise, I will keep you informed of the verdict when it comes in on August 12th or somewhere near that time. Again, thank you so much for listening.